Henderson about it. And I had actually called you that day and said, kind of give me the background and the context. And so what I want to do is talk about this conservation program at Aquarium of the Pacific, because in my mind, when I met you, it was such an interesting thing, having known what Monterey Bay Aquarium was doing with Seafood Watch, and then to see that extension, and honestly, a little bit risky stake in the ground that Aquarium of the Pacific decided to do around ocean aquaculture. So can you give us some context about that and how that program and your efforts came to be?
Sure. First, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to Jen. We could talk all the time. And Crystal, it's very nice to meet you. We tend to be the problem children of the sustainable seafood world, if you will. But I think we're a good problem. We keep things interesting. So the Aquarium of the Pacific is heavily invested in marine aquaculture, in short, because we do believe it is, based on the science, based on the information we have, it is an important conservation tool. We know that climate change is here now. We know that we have a growing population and we have demands that need to be met. At the same time, we know on land, there's a lot of habitat fragmentation. We have species that are going extinct. We're going to have to get very creative and very bold in the solutions we select in order to move forward in a responsible way so that we're minimizing our impacts on the environment while also meeting these demands and these challenges. And marine aquaculture is a really important tool to do that. Specific to our, I guess you could say, more aggressive approach to supporting the growth and development, the responsible growth and development of marine aquaculture in the US is because, research has shown that the US, we do have the regulatory capacity, we have the ecological capacity, and we have the scientific capacity to do it the right way. Also, from a standpoint of taking responsibility for our own consumption, we are the largest consumer of resource-intensive meat on the planet. Mm-hmm. So we do need to accept some of that risk ourselves. And again, what marine aquaculture can do, it can complement our well-managed wild capture fisheries. It can complement our land-based agriculture systems to create a more stable and resilient supply, also with greater assurances that it is done in a responsible way. It could also reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with flying our seafood halfway around the world. Mm-hmm. So, as my boss, Dr. Jerry Schubel, likes to say, it may not be the silver bullet, but it might just be the silver buckshot that we desperately need.
It has been, and under his leadership, did it come to you through his leadership, or how did the program begin? And talk a little bit about what's happening specifically at the aquarium, because I know Crystal probably hasn't seen it, but just even the messaging and what you've put into the aquarium for the public that in normal times would be able to come and visit, there's an incredible amount of education that you're doing there as well.
Sure, yeah. And I think we're going to get into it a little later, but, bridging science and perceptions is really a main focus of what we do. So the reason the program got started at the Aquarium of the Pacific is, the Aquarium of the Pacific at large as an institution has always prided itself on its ability to bridge science and the public through outreach and education, but also to be a convener of diverse stakeholders to really tackle these really complex issues that there are no easy solutions, right? So how do we move forward in a manner that's best for society and the environment? Uh-huh. So Seafood for the Future was born out of a forum that was put together, a sustainable seafood forum in collaboration with the Aquarium and King Seafood, NOAA Fisheries, and a handful of others to discuss, the current discussions around sustainable seafood and whether or not perhaps we should be shifting this dialogue a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so that's really how our program was born. We initially did start out just like Monterey Bay and the others, where we were a recommendation program. We evaluated menus and we made recommendations. And since I took the wheel, we've kind of shifted out of that realm, and we're now focused again more on that broader, how do we bridge science and perception so we can actually get these farms in the water and operating? Because we could talk about what's sustainable and what's not so we're blue in the face. If we have no farms in the water, it's kind of a moot point.
Right.
So this is really where we've shifted our focus. And then at the aquarium, so if you were to visit the aquarium itself, we have a number of programs we've developed over the years. We have our Science on a Sphere program with NOAA on marine aquaculture. It's developed in 2014, I believe. And that one is actually available in 160 SOS platforms worldwide, and it has actually been translated into Japanese and Spanish. So that's pretty exciting. And then we have through our Pacific Visions wing, which is amazing. And it really is a testament to Jerry and the aquarium. And again, kind of our overall vision of how do we meet these needs of a growing population, in a changing climate in a sustainable way. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of aquaculture as part of the solution peppered in there. Of course, with a number of other things, right? You've also got renewable energy and, regenerative agriculture. There's a whole bunch of things that we touch upon in that exhibit. And I highly recommend it if you ever get a chance when we open again, fingers crossed that it's soon, that you can visit Pacific Visions. And then kind of offline, so we have a number of education tools we're working on developing specific for K through 12 for marine aquaculture. We have a module that we're finishing up now. And then through our Ocean to Table series, which we launched in 2018, it was funded by Sea Grant. And you could go on and you get those videos now. And it's a series of looking at 5 different aquaculture ventures in the US. And the idea was to humanize the farmers, to show the connection between science and the farms, and then to familiarize people with what these farms look like, right? Because we actually surveyed some people at the aquarium long ago when we held a lecture series on aquaculture. We asked them, what is it that you want to know about marine aquaculture? What's the biggest mystery? And they, said, we don't even know what it looks like. We know what a dairy farm looks like or what a chicken farm looks like, but you keep talking about these marine aquaculture farms and we have no idea. Like our imaginations are running wild. And you can imagine then from a perception standpoint, how it's so easy for some of these groups to inject kind of negative images as well.
When no one has that picture in their mind, it's very, very difficult to sort of understand that journey of the water farmer. And it's something that the aquarium and the messaging and all of the work that you've done around that piece in terms of what narrative we all should be taking on has been such an important part of your work. And Crystal, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this because the dialogue that has been this narrative that has been created, in terms of seafood trade-offs and protecting the environment, because we do have huge inputs of fish and seafood that's coming from outside of the United States. When we started to look at what this bill was that was coming into Congress and looking at what all of those intersects were with NOAA, how all of these pieces were going to come together, that were going to lead to sustainable, ethical aquaculture in waters. And with, as Kim has said, with these issues around perception, which we are all too familiar with. I mean, we have heard this. I mean, we have been yelled at. We have had trouble kind of connecting and creating that narrative, as Kim has said. And so give us a little bit of perspective as you're working at Hatch on this current narrative around marine aquaculture's role in terms of sustainability, conservation, but also needing to attribute to a food system so in desperate need for it.
Yeah, and thanks for having us here. This is a passion that's close to my heart. How aquaculture is involved with sustainability in general. And so I feel like one of the most important factors in this conversation is the pressure on wild stocks. No matter how well a fishery is managed, we're still going to be meeting the quotas. There's always going to be more demand than is available. So I do feel that aquaculture can take some of the pressure off of these wild stocks, by shifting some of that demand to sustainably farmed seafood. And the other piece of this is aquaculture can be done right. If you have the right feeds, sustainable feeds, if you have the right farming techniques, of course there's ways to do it wrong. And we've seen stories about that. And this is what pops into people's minds a lot of times when they immediately, are against aquaculture. But we could say the same thing about cattle or ag. It doesn't stop us from growing it or even eating those products. We still eat beef, we still eat lettuce, but we find better ways to grow our foods. And the other piece of this is, the certification. We can trust that the certification will inform us on the traceability and the sustainability of the products. So yeah, wild stocks, versus aquaculture, there's always going to be, some sort of trade-off, but it's minimizing the trade-offs. I think that's the important part.
It is very interesting in my work because I talk about this landscape of consumptive entitlement. And I do feel like there are conversations around, well, of course, I expect my fish and seafood to be wild. And for those people that are tuning in, you all are probably thinking, why do you keep repeating this stuff I already know? Of course, I know that the oceans are depleted. Of course, you keep talking about this, but our fisheries are sustainably managed. And I look at it as this consumptive entitlement, that we feel entitled to eat wild resources when it's related to the sea. And we don't think about all of this connective tissue that really creates a problem throughout the entire food system, not the least of which, of course, is carbon footprint. And if we were to really look at it, if we were talking, Kim, to Julie Kuchapata from Fair Trade, we would also be talking about all of these equitable things around economy and building sustainable economies around aquaculture, which is also part of it. One of the things, Kim, that I wanted to talk to you about, though, is related specifically to this EO and also to the bill that will come behind it. Because we talked to Margaret last week, and she was very clear, as were you, that, NOAA has managed fisheries very well, having things streamlined through NOAA to be able to get these concessions into the water. And I immediately said to you, how are we going to know? What's the voice of conservation, sustainability? Because we have been part of the dialogue where those organizations have protested sustainable aquaculture. So how do we create a narrative, a balance in this? And one of the things that you pointed out that always gets highlighted is the failure of a shellfish farm in California, and suggesting that that failure is proof that we don't have the regulatory capacity to be able to responsibly farm in U.S. waters. And we see this, whether it's the issue that's in Maine, whether it was the issue in Washington, that whenever this comes up, there are concerns that come along with it. So let's talk about that. What is the regulatory infrastructure to farm sustainably in U.S. waters, and how can the Aqua Act help to address those concerns?
And these are fair questions, right? I mean, if you look at some of these operations that didn't quite go to plan, it can certainly be a black eye, and it can certainly result in questions. But in terms of taking a step back and looking at the broader regulatory infrastructure, there's actually been research that has shown that the U.S. is among the countries that has the greatest regulatory capacity to support responsible marine aquaculture development. We do have the bones. We have the foundational pieces in the form of, sorry, I just keep getting these updates. We have those foundational pieces in the form of strong proven regulations such as the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. We have HACCP, which is a world-renowned way to ensure food safety throughout the supply chain. So we know how to address a lot of these issues. Where we do fall a little short, and this is likely a reason that may have affected some of these farms, is the mandate, the executive mandate, the legislative mandate for strengthening the interagency collaboration. So each of these agencies is already mandated to enforce certain aspects of these different regulations that already exist. What they're not necessarily mandated to do is to cooperate and, work with other agencies to reduce those redundancies for asking for information, for example, or in enforcement, whose job is it to enforce? And that's not always clear. So what a piece of legislation like the Aqua Act can do is it can really help to clarify those things. So what it would do is it would designate, in this case, NOAA as the lead federal agency to coordinate the NEPA process, which is the environmental impact statement piece of it. It would then strengthen through mandates the ability for agencies then to effectively collaborate. And this could then, again, reduce then those potential redundancies and requests for information. It could also strengthen their ability to enforce by having those clearer chains of command as per the conditions of the permits. And so indirectly what that would do then is it helps provide a more investor friendly environment in the US aquaculture sector. And, again, it also provides those greater assurances that there is that stronger, more coordinated approach to enforcement of compliance.
And I guess that's really the first step, right? Is to understand. And that's part of it, is that there are a lot of layers of this act that will be part of the bill that aren't part of the EO, right? Because the EO was fairly short, and I think it brought up a lot of concerns. And part of it was that the perception is that we don't have enough scientific information. We don't have enough information as an industry to be able to responsibly farm offshore in the US. And so I wonder how we can fully understand those risks and how we can mitigate them. I think it's something like, do you agree that there are those concerns? Have we gotten to a point as an industry where we fully understand the issues and we can tackle them in the right way so that we don't have some of the concerns, for example, like what happened with the shellfish farm?
And so this is so the whole fully thing, it's interesting because this just came up in another piece of draft legislation. We will never fully understand, because that's the process of science, and that's the beauty of science, right? Science is all about asking questions. Mm-hmm. What we as a society have to ask ourselves at a certain point is, at what point do we know enough to move forward in a manner that won't come with those unacceptable risks? And on the flip side of that, though, then what are those unacceptable risks we're willing to accept if we don't do it? From a scientific perspective, the US has some world-class research institutions in the oceanography space. We have a number of researchers who are already engaged in marine aquaculture research, and we have some of the best studied areas of ocean in the world. And again, as I pointed to earlier, there's actually been research that shows not only that we have the regulatory capacity to do it right, but it also shows we have the ecological capacity. So if you combine those pieces, the science, the regulatory, and the ecological capacity, it doesn't make sense that we're not doing it. Right. So I think just as a society, we have to decide at what point do we know enough. And if you're waiting to fully understand, that's not possible, because that's not how it works.
Mm-hmm. Crystal, talk about that, because part of the role with Hatch, I mean, when we think about this accelerator and the work that Hatch is doing, this is exactly the reason why you would want to work in alignment with whether it's Aquarium of the Pacific or other companies that are bringing these technologies, whether it's feed systems, data collection, equipment. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah, so you and I had talked about, kind of moving the needle in terms of social and political license, for around marine aquaculture development. So to answer that, I kind of look at it very simply, and there's sort of a top-down, bottom-up perspective where you've got consumers on one end and the public, you've got the government and policymakers on the other, and then meeting somewhere in the middle to catalyze the changes that need to be made. In this case, we're talking about policy. I'm from the perspective of you can bring in experts that don't have financial interests to help the agencies coordinate and lay a roadmap. There's a lot of ways this can be addressed. And so Hatch, we're also investing in technologies that help move this whole thing along. As far as changing public perception, I feel that we need to start with making the public aware that they're part of the problem. They need to understand that a lot of the issues stem from their eating habits. We have the buying power as the consumer to buy farmed versus wild caught. If you go into a restaurant and you demand, like Jennifer was saying, that entitlement of, I only want wild caught. I don't even want to hear the specials that are, farm raised. Well, that is attributing to part of that problem. So, educating the public, it's a huge task. It's not an easy one, and it's an expensive one. The government, I believe, needs to support this with funding to help change the public perception. But then you've got the other side of it where, the policies that are put in place, they need to be able to assure the consumers that the seafood they're buying is sustainably raised, and that these policies are safeguards to prevent our industry from making any big mistakes. This information, the public needs to be made aware of so they can make smart purchasing decisions. Whole Foods, I think, is a good example. They have done a good job of, marketing their food to their customers with traceability, transparency, and I can't even imagine how much it costs. It's an expensive endeavor for them to do. I've actually been a vendor on the other side of that. My family owned the largest seafood company in Hawaii, so I was raised in commercial fishing my whole life, and so I've been involved in wholesale seafood distribution, and have been, running different parts of that company. And what it allowed me was to be in every kitchen in the entire state of Hawaii, working with the chefs one-on-one, talking to them about, the different sustainable seafoods that are out there that they can put on their menus. And a lot of times you hear back from the chefs, well, my customers don't want to hear about that, and so this is where I think we need a broader, we need more help to educate the public so that it can go, from both sides.
Kim, let's talk about that for a second, because so much of what you've been involved in, I'd love for everyone to understand the process that you've gone through in terms of education and messaging, because so much of what you've done is to help sort of talk about it. So as an industry, we talk about it within the same context, that we have the same messaging around it, so that we are really becoming more united than before. And let's talk about that process, why you felt like that had to be called out, because again, that public perception, social license, NIMBY, not in my backyard, I don't want the farm where I can see it. There's a lot of misperception that's around that. And certainly we found that in making the film. And you and I talked about this with Journey of a Waterman. It's a very difficult thing to get through.
It is. I feel like it might be job security for me because there's not a lot of people doing it right now. So yeah, it's really important. I think to build off of what Crystal was saying, so I do think we need to, often if we look at social perception, sometimes I think we get stuck in the consumer side of it, but we have to remember there's a whole other piece. If we're talking about getting public acceptance to get permits for farms, that's a much more broad public, some of which may not even be seafood consumers. So it is really important in order to address that, and in order to get them on board, we do need all hands on deck, because, if it's just an aquarium saying it, or if it's just a restaurant or a specific farm, they say that people have to hear things, like 3 times before it kind of sinks in. But there's also the confusion factor that adds to issues with social perceptions, right? How many of us have heard the story of the person who went to the seafood counter? They were looking at the seafood and they think it might be a good choice, but they're so confused in terms of sustainability and health news that they keep hearing conflicting information that they move to the beef. And if they did that, who really won besides the beef industry? From a conservation perspective, none of us won, unless that beef was fed seaweed. I don't know. But so, it is, but the hard part about getting people on board with that then, so if you're a business and you are investing limited resources, it's one thing to invest in your own marketing, right? Because you can get that instant gratification. You can see where you put your resources. You can see either it increased your sales, stabilized, decreased. If it decreased, you can get rid of that and move your resources elsewhere. Addressing social perceptions is a larger public education endeavor. There is no instant gratification. And honestly, we can make best guesses if, say, we get to a point where a farm's getting permitted and there was less opposition. But that instant gratification of this worked or this isn't necessarily there. And it's not necessarily going to boost a specific farm's sales, right? We have to look at this as a collaborative, all boats rise model, where collectively we want to see farms getting acceptance and getting permitted in US waters, and this is what it's going to take. NOAA through Sea Grant is funding some of these efforts. They did fund our Ocean to Table series. And one of the things that's really interesting about that is we actually, as a part of that grant, was we had to conduct an evaluation of the video series to see if it was actually effective in changing hearts and minds about aquaculture. So we hired a consulting firm that actually specializes in testing messages for aquariums and science institutions. And what they found in it was a 2-part survey, in total about 1,300 participants. the rise in perceptions before and after watching the videos was significant. I mean, these guys who specialize in message testing were actually pleasantly surprised about how far we were able to move that needle. And, you know, the secret sauce or the formula that we used was, and Jen, you and I have talked about this, we humanized the farmers, we put a face, it was no longer a faceless industry. We identified the farms so that they could start to get familiar with what do these farms actually look like. So we had a whole bunch of footage there. And then we showed that connection between the scientists and the farm. So it wasn't just a farm deciding I'm going to farm here because I want to, right? There's a whole scientific process. So you're starting to build that trust and you're starting to build that social contract with the broader public. But again, this is a slow, painful process. And I think that's the hard part, and that's why it's such a hard sell.
Well, and I think so for me, as I've looked at the companies that I've worked with and the individuals that I've worked with, part of this narrative is that we skipped a step. So if I think about even in my own history, or like Crystal was talking about, you know, she has this legacy of fish and seafood and her family, right? And that connection. So if I were to take that same connection with me in food, it's going to go all the way back to my grandfather and my great grandfather that were third generation family cattlemen in rural Colorado. My grandmother was my great grandmother was one of the first to ever settle the eastern plains of Colorado. They raised cattle, they had a general store, they sold their goods, their vegetables and everything in the general store. And so obviously when someone, even today, if you were to talk about a cattle ranch, my mind is going to go right back to my grandfather's ranch, right? To be fair. But the problem I personally think with aquaculture is that we never got that romanticized side of the story. We all want to connect to story and to history and to legacy. And when you go from nothing to, in let's say chicken, to a commodity chicken ranch, all of a sudden you don't have any connection to it at all. And I think that now knowing after working with Alf Goran Knudsen and his family, 44-year-old farm, you know, raising salmon in the Arctic Circle, and I can see the grandfather and his father having raised the fish and they're preserving legacy and economy on their island, all of a sudden I go, that's the story I've been waiting for. Someone that can champion it so that it doesn't look like a big, scary grid out in the middle of the ocean with millions of fish in it, you know, that feels very commoditized. It's not sexy. And so I think, you know, one of the things that when we made the movie, and this film that we made was called Journey of the Waterman. It was with 10-time world champion surfer and paddleboarder Jamie Mitchell. And we found out that it wasn't so much that the surf community even understood about aquaculture. It was that they just didn't want to look at it. They just thought, you know, if there's that net out there in the horizon in my line of sight, I just don't want it to be there. So then out of that comes the game of telephone. Well, it attracts sharks and it hurts my surf break and it, you know, and it's all these poopy, gross waters and like all of these things that build something. And then when amplified by a narrative on social media and everything else, that creates this momentum that we have a really tough time coming back from. And so I wonder, and there's a question in there, I wonder if, you know, part of this isn't how do we come together as a group? Because like avocados, like pork is the other white meat, like the Got Milk campaign, we've got to have something really big with a lot of momentum. And it doesn't have to happen for very long, you know, a few years, but it's going to have to get big funding to change that shift. Is that true? Or because the population is already eating more farmed fish and seafood than they are wild in the US, that it's more just something like, I don't want to say we need to come clean with it, but we haven't as aquaculturists come out and said, hey, look, it is farmed.
So is your question then, do we need that big
campaign? Because that campaign, Got Milk campaign, is $40 million a year. Tied to how many gallons it's a certain, you know, it's however much it is now per gallon of milk is tied to it, just in a similar way to ASME and others that, you know, is public perception going to be changed in this little kind of organic way? Or are we going to have something even maybe ahead of the bill, Kim? Because Crystal and I talked about this, and it's like the bill felt like it was a little bit the cart before the horse, because we have bad perception of aquaculture, and then we've got perception of these issues around it, and then all of a sudden this administration pushes this agenda forward, and there's not a lot of education out there about what the bill was. So I'm just thinking, from a perception perspective, we want to get out and tell the stories you're telling, but how do we do that in the absence of big funding?
So I do think it has to be something big, in that we need, again, all hands on deck. But in terms of funding, I actually think there may be ways now, and we're learning this through COVID, right? We're actually working on a campaign right now that highlights the science piece of it. Because of social media, because of our ability where people can use their phones and record, I think we still need funding, but I think the amount of funding may not be as much as we think it might be. And I've actually been thinking about this, and I actually have an idea, and we should definitely chat about this very soon.
I think that feels like, Crystal, that feels like some work for us.
But, I think if you have the right coordination, I think if you, again, follow that right formula, we know through those surveys that were conducted, there is a general formula, which is, the humanizing piece, it's the connecting the science piece, and it's the familiarizing. And this is something, if we can get, different farms to film, to get us some of those images, then we could package, and we could, build a, kind of consistent framework about how we package these, and then how we distribute them out through these networks. I think there are ways to do this in a relatively inexpensive way, thanks to social media and, the improvements in cell phones and taking
influencers, chefs now. I mean, when I started in this 10 years ago, and Crystal, you probably had the same thing. It was an all red no-go on the farm. And now, I have chefs calling saying, one chef that I work with, Mark Esty, who called last week and said, I've refused to put farmed fish and seafood on my menu. And now guess what? I'm willing to do it. Tell me what the ones are that I should be supporting. And so I want you to think about Mark, my buddy Mark, that's a 10-year kind of, he's seen us doing this work and posting, and now all of a sudden he's, bringing that opportunity to the table. So I feel like there's a window, right? Or a little crack in the door where it's not as hard to sit down with these chefs because of the type of work that we've all been doing.
Yeah, and I think, so you look at the people that we have on this right here, right? So you have, the brands, you have the chefs. I could bring the scientists to the table and the farmers themselves. And then Crystal also has the farmers. She also has the innovators who are bringing all these cool innovations that are going to help us do it even better. So if you have the right people together, I think you could do this in a relatively inexpensive way.
So let's talk really quickly about, we're starting to get some questions, and Crystal, we got a lot of questions last week about what the role is that RAS plays in this, all of the on-land innovations around aquaculture. So Jesse Brockmeyer has sent a question, and I want to get to some of these so we have enough time. It says, are inland RAS systems thought of as a sustainable solution? So I'm going to put that out to you, Kim, to start with, because what this bill specifically addresses is open ocean, net pen, aquaculture concessions, correct? But we're seeing a big movement right now in on-land development of aquaculture systems. So from your perspective, are they thought of as a sustainable solution?
They're part of the sustainable solution. So again, if we're going to address these challenges that we have, the solutions are going to be equally as challenging. And that means we're going to need a diverse portfolio of solutions. And, this is one of the things that kind of drives me batty, actually, about the arguments for RAS, because they're important. They're a part of the solution, but they also come with trade-offs. So, for example, they're trying to get operations in California, which I'm not opposed to. But let's also be honest that then is taking land that is going to require fresh water. And there is an energy consumption component to that, which adds to greenhouse gas emissions. So, and then offshore, of course, has its own trade-offs. So if you're looking, though, at building a more stable and resilient supply, let's say you have, a lot of fires, or you have a terrible drought. You may have to shut down those land-based systems, and you may want to shift to the offshore production. But then maybe you have a year with really bad storms and offshore really isn't the best solution. Maybe then you're shifting to those onshore. Onshore also plays a really important role in landlocked states. If we're talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transporting fish, that's a really important piece of the solution. So I think we just need to look at all of these options and understand and recognize in a very honest way what these trade-offs are.
Absolutely. I mean, it's always going to be about balance. Crystal, what about from your perspective? Because so much of the technology that's coming on board and the investment is coming to these land-based systems.
Yeah, I think, you know, what Kim said, the diversified portfolio is really the key. You can't have just all your eggs in one basket. That doesn't make any sense. The technology with aquaculture, this is what excites me about this field. You know, my background is actually tech also. And what I love seeing is that we're sort of in this Wild West area where aquaculture, it's really, it's gaining momentum in the technology sector. And that's right where Hatch is. And so, you know, there's going to be risks with RAS systems, as with anything else, of course. You know, and that's where policy comes in. I mean, this is where we really need to focus on making sure that the policy will ensure that we're not going to make big mistakes, whether it's RAS or offshore.
No, that's exactly correct. And one of the questions that we have from Tony Rye is, for a possible new RAS aquaculture farmer like him, what type of grants, what type of help is out there so that there can be access to new ventures? And I think I'd also like to ask how that also applies to the broader landscape. So Kim, what kind of investment? You have people come speak to your board all of the time. I'm curious about where those investment dollars are coming from your perspective to be investing in this American aquaculture system.
For the RAS specifically, I'm going to defer to Crystal, but you know, and that's it's kind of a chicken egg scenario for investments, right? I think we see that there are investors who are interested and engaged, and there are private investment companies. You mentioned last week, Christy Walton even has thrown her hat in the ring here and has a successful operation, by the way, off the coast of Panama. So, you know, there is interest, but the issue is in the US, I mean, you really got to be willing and have deep pockets to see if you can even just get the permit. So I think, you know, unfortunately, until, and this is where the Aqua Act, I really do believe could help, you know, until we get to that place where we have a more predictable and consistent framework for getting farms in the water, I think the options are going to be limited, but we do know that there is interest, at least in our experience, from a lot of private investors who want to see marine aquaculture as part of the solution for meeting these challenges ahead.
And Crystal, what about from your perspective?
You know, to answer his question, investors, you know, they need to feel that, you know, the risk isn't obviously too high. Which does go back to the permitting. So given, let's just say the permitting isn't a problem, you're able to get the farm up, you know, I don't know of all the different government programs that are out there. You know, NOAA obviously is a big proponent of aquaculture. That would be one place to start, I would assume. And then, you know, working the investor circuit, obviously, you know, it's like what Kim said, deep pockets, depending how big the RAS farm is that you're going for. I would say those would be the two areas to go to.
Yeah, because there's been this perception that investment is mainly going on the technology side and not actually trickling all the way down to the farm. Do you think that's true?
Farms are very expensive. You know, Hatch, we don't invest in farms. We invest in the technology that's scalable. The farms, we just don't have the pockets deep enough for it, right? And so farms are very, you know, capital intensive. You know, it's a good question. I think a lot of it does go back to the permitting, you know, just being, you know, secure as an investor to know that in 5 years, I'm going to be able to, you know, make X back.
Yeah, and that's still, there's still, besides just the permitting, there's a lot to tackle, right? Are you rearing at a species that's going to be marketable? There's a lot of conversation, like with open blue. Kim, I think you pointed out in Panama, maybe it was you, Crystal, that, are you rearing a species that is going to be able to be raised from hatchery all the way to harvest in a sustainable way and come to market at a price, and at a price that is has good distribution and can that people can afford. One of the other questions that we got from Palmi Palmason is asking to touch base on aquaculture in the U.S., the entire different landscape. So marine, pond, RAS, in the context of the regulations, Kim, and the red tape and the opportunities now for all of that and potential under this EO. It didn't really touch, nor did it need to, on land-based systems. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, it was just focused on marine.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Because that's the one where we've had such limited concessions, correct? And mainly under state regulations.
Yeah, I mean, I think you still have, RAS is also facing its own challenges, but that's a, regulatory infrastructure in the marine environment is a very different beast than what it is on land. And because we do have a lot of more established aquaculture on the land-based side, I don't know for sure, but I don't know that the red tape is quite as bad. I know in certain states like California, it's probably pretty bad. But I think that's really going to depend on the state in which you're trying to get those permits.
And Crystal, what about from your perspective, just on the technology side? Because those systems, part of the issue from my perspective is that those systems have not reared good fish. That we have to think about what ultimately gets on the table, and we can have these taste tests. And when we're comparing it to marine-based aquaculture or even to wild fish, it's still really hard to bring those systems up to speed in an effort to raise the best fish. I mean, what is your perspective? What are you seeing from a technology perspective coming down the pipeline to help us make those systems more efficient?
Well, I think I understand what you're saying. So you're saying that RAS systems are not producing a fish that's as tasty as one that would be produced wild or out in pens?
I think that that's some of the issue. I wouldn't say in all cases, but I definitely am hearing from chefs, when we look at it and lay the fish out, there's something about that miroir, the flavor of the water and all of that that's missing. And at the end of the day, again, it's expensive to produce. Kim, you may have something to jump in here with this, but it's expensive to produce on land. Yes, it's efficient, but there are costs. And if you're not rearing a fish that then can take to get that, price on it, at the end of the day, it's taste and price.
I think it depends on the species too. Some species are really going to, Dover sole. I went to the largest Dover sole facility. I think it was in Iceland. It was land-based. Delicious. And I don't think thered be another way to do it because they're the flatfish, that need shallow water and whatnot. So I think certain species lend itself to RAS versus open ocean. But yeah, I mean, it all comes down to taste. When somebody wants me to invest in a tilapia farm, my first question is always, do you eat tilapia? Whether it's tilapia, whether it's the Dover sole or salmon, it all comes down to flavor and price. And so if you don't have those things, if you don't have the demand, then don't bother. And it doesn't make any sense.
And Kim, what about from your perspective, diversity in species? Because I think that when people saw the CEO and the bill that's coming behind it, they immediately thought of salmon. And so am I wrong?
No, I don't think you were wrong.
Yeah. So tell me, I mean, you are the expert. Tell us about that and what other opportunities are. I mean, I have said to you before, I wish we could just take salmon off the table. I think if you had come out with this and the EO and the Act and said, nobody that's producing salmon is going to get to swim in these waters, we're going to try to have development of a different, broader species, because salmon has been the good actor and the bad actor, right? People probably would have been maybe a little more open to it, or am I wrong?
Yeah, salmon is definitely, for better or worse, it's been a black eye, right? There's plenty of responsible salmon producers. I'm a huge fan, and I think we should support the responsible actors. Maybe if they're not so responsible, I wish the industry would do a better job of weeding out the herd. But I do think, again, if we're going back to public perceptions, if you're talking about the general public, they don't always see the nuances that we understand. And to them, a fish farm is a fish farm is a fish farm. So if they see and hear about this huge, massive escape and all of these implications that it had, they're not going to differentiate between the salmon or the proposed yellowtail or the cobia or whatever that may be. So I think that's where, again, public education really comes into play. And another important piece for us to consider as we're developing these broader education efforts is differentiating between nearshore and offshore. Because that's also a huge differentiator in terms of, why it might be a more responsible choice. And again, that does have trade-offs because now you're adding to greenhouse gas emissions to get the boats out offshore and it's not as safe. But, I do think we need to do a better job, but you're right. I think, when consumers, or not just consumers, the general public sees this information, they're instantly going to go to the little information that they know about this, which is those headlines that they've heard about those bad incidents.
So we had a question, though, that was interesting from Gracie White. She said, Aquarium of the Pacific is clearly a leader in conservation aquaculture, sea bass, abalone projects. Are there similar perceptions, issues towards those projects, or have they escaped that barrier?
Well, so does she mean the conservation as in restocking programs?
I think she's saying sea bass and abalone, so I think that is.
So abalone, I'm not aware of a lot of pushback on that. It seems to do really well, but again, abalone is a little different because you've got the restoration projects. I think everybody's a fan of, as long as we can do it the right way. And then the second piece of that was with aquaculture. It tends to be a land-based operation anyway. They're low trophic species. They tend to fly under the radar. They're also a very different market. So, we don't really see pushback on that. The sea bass can be a little tricky. So the aquarium doesn't participate in these restocking efforts directly. But so Hub SeaWorld Research Institute, for example, has a restocking program where they raise the sea bass and they release them. And that can have it has a little bit of controversy, right? So the question is, what is it really doing good? Is it really restocking the populations? And are there genetic implications to doing this? And we're also hearing the same argument, by the way, with our salmon restocking programs.
Yes.
So that can get a little bit trickier. I feel like the moral of the story is anytime we're dealing with finfish and the more charismatic species, that's where it starts to get trickier no matter what you do. So I don't know that really answers the question, but.
Crystal, this question is for you. It's from Neil Sims. And he asks, when it comes to the FAD effects that fishing community has seen around the offshore net pens in Hawaii, that's sure one way to win over the social license.
Yeah, thanks, Neil, for the question. Definitely with the local fishermen, so that's a smaller community, especially within Hawaii and maybe even throughout the U.S., for offshore. It does help bring more fish species to go fishing for, and so it is popular with the fishermen. So I think public perception, Neil knows better than anybody on this. It's everything in getting things passed. So that would identify, or it would target one of the small markets. You've still got quite a few other people to please.
Well, I can't thank you both enough for joining me this week. I mean, we've had so many questions. We had a lot of questions last week, and I think you both are keenly aware that this is a huge conversation. I mean, the Aqua Act, the current executive order, these are really only one step down, in my opinion, a very complicated path to developing contributive, sustainable aquaculture industry in the US that's accepted by all of the stakeholders, including consumers. And I think we're really only just beginning, but I think we'd all agree also that it's our passion, it's the specialty of these focuses on sustainable aquaculture that can really help us move the needle. And I think we all agree that this is the future of fish and seafood. There's so many incredible, thoughts and like-mindedness in this space, the brains in the room that really want us to be able to ensure a healthy, ocean-friendly marine protein into the future, and aquaculture is part of that system. So we know this. We have challenges, we have victories that we can speak to at every single level of the supply chain, and that we can really move this into the future. In the words of my dear friend Barton Seaver, he said, this is the first time we have a chance to develop a new food system and do it the way we want and have it done right. And so this isn't just an industry. I think this is something that Kim and I both feel really close to. It's that this is the story of this chain of well-being from the water to the plate, and the stories that we tell around it are the things that are going to be able to get that more broad acceptance and adoption. So Kim, congratulations on all of your efforts. I cannot imagine, as you're championing these things in front of your board and in front of these spaces, it is a very unique path that you're cutting that we are all following. So thank you. And I want to thank you both for your collaboration and all of your efforts. Have a wonderful day, and we'll look forward to continuing this. Tune in next week. We've got some great topics each week coming. We thank the whole Hatch Blue team.